Amen. Good morning, church. So very good to see you this morning. You know that I tell you every week I love you and I appreciate you, but some weeks I like to be more specific about why I love you so very much. There's so many reasons why I love this congregation, but last Sunday was one of those reasons. We had a table in the foyer. We were giving out names for those that wanted to adopt a child to buy gifts for the Angel Tree program, and it got announced in first service, but before second service, all the names were already gone, and people had already signed up to take those names. And I know that many of you have already signed up to take gifts down to South Texas. So very generous, this congregation. On Wednesday, I saw the crowd of people for our Friends Speak dinner in there. We had so many people from this congregation and people that they had been reading with from our community, from all over the world, people and food from all over the world, sharing time and love with each other. On Thursday, our Hearts and Hands group was here making gifts to give to people that in need, to children and to others, all of the different ministries that the Hearts and Hands program helps with. On Saturday, there was a group of people here to load up all of the hundreds and hundreds of bags of potatoes that you donated to share with our community. Those are some of the reasons that I love this church, your generosity, the way you love our community, the way that you love our neighbors, the way that you're sharing and helping. But it's not just this congregation. There are churches throughout the world that are doing these kinds of things to love and to bless and to help our neighbors, our brothers and sisters in Edmond at the Memorial Road congregation. I was just reading about what they do every year. The Memorial Road congregation has an international Thanksgiving dinner every year. And what's interesting and I think wonderful about the way that they do it is that they prepare the meal halal, meaning that it's permissible for Muslims to enjoy and to be part of that meal. Last year, they fed 300 refugees from Afghanistan who had been resettled in their community. This kind of thing is what Christians do. This is what churches do. Love our neighbors, help our neighbors, bless our neighbors. That's true, and I want us to think about that truth, that reality. But here's another reality. 46% of non-Christian people have a negative perception of the local church. I just want you to think about that statistic for just a second. 46% of non-Christian people in the United States have a negative perception of the local church. That's not the percentage of people who have no feelings one way or the other about the local church. That's about 33%. But 46% of non-Christian people have a negative perception about the local church. And to be fair, some of that negative perception is warranted. Some of that negative perception is deserved, but some of it is not. Some of it is not. And maybe you've felt some of that negative perception pointed your way. Maybe you have friends and family or neighbors or coworkers or classmates who have a negative perception about Christians or who have a negative perception about the church, and you've felt that animosity. You felt people that accuse you of things that aren't really true, that believe things about you that aren't true, that make assumptions about you that aren't true. And maybe you feel like the level of negative perception in our culture is rising. Maybe you feel like more and more people have a negative perception about Christians or about the church. And again, maybe you've felt that firsthand. Maybe you felt that personally. And some of it is warranted and some of it is not. Some of the things that they think about you personally or about us collectively, some of it is unfair. Some of it is untrue. So my question for us is, what do we do? How do we respond? How do we respond when people have negative perceptions about the church? How do we respond when people have negative perceptions about us because we're followers of Jesus? Do we get angry? Do we get mad? Do we stomp our feet? Do we raise our fists? Do we get afraid? Do we get defensive? How do we respond when people have a negative perception about Christians or about the church, when they feel negatively about us, when they make assumptions about us, when they make accusations about us, especially if those accusations aren't true? What do we do? How do we respond? We've read several times in this series, and I want to read it again. 1 Peter chapter 3, starting in verse 13. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 13. Now, he asked this question rhetorically. Now, who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? Peter asked this question, and it makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Who's going to harm you if you're zealous for what is good? Who's going to harm you because you feed your neighbors? Who's going to harm you because you care about the homeless? Who's going to harm you because you love your enemies? Who's going to harm you because you lay your sword down and say, I'm not going to hurt anybody. I'm not going to harm anybody. I'm going to love everybody. Who's going to harm you when that's the way you live your life? And for the most part, that's true. But Peter's not a fool. He knows that sometimes even if you love your neighbor, sometimes even if you love your enemy, sometimes even if you're following Jesus and you're doing what you're called to do, they will hate you anyway. They'll accuse you anyway. They'll be afraid of you anyway. So what do? How do you respond when you're doing what you're supposed to do and they hate you anyway and they're afraid of you anyway and they accuse you anyway? He says, but even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be, what's the word, church? Blessed. You will be blessed. If you suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled, but in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that's in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. We spent a lot of time talking about that phrase there. Verse 16, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. He says, when you are slandered, not necessarily if you are slandered, but when you are slandered, when they talk bad about you anyway, when they falsely accuse you anyway, when they hate you anyway, you live your life with a good conscience. Do what you're supposed to do anyway. Live your life with a good conscience so that when they slander you, they will be put to shame, so that there's no proof to the accusations that they're making. We've been following the Apostle Paul and seeing how he's a real life example and how Luke gives us his story of how he lived out exactly what Peter is talking about, how he lived this out, how Paul went to the city of Jerusalem knowing that when he got to Jerusalem, people were going to hate him, knowing that something bad was going to happen to him in Jerusalem. And when he showed up, the elders of the church in Jerusalem said, Paul, people don't like you very much here. They've heard all kinds of rumors about you. They believe all kinds of things that aren't true about you. And so Paul went out of his way to become all things to all people, to prove to the people in Jerusalem, I'm one of you. He went to the temple, he purified himself, he took part in ritual and ceremony and custom to prove that he is one of them, that he's not against them, to prove I'm not against the Jewish people, I'm not against our customs, I'm not against the temple, I'm not against the law of Moses. He did everything he could to try to show them that he was one of them, and they hated him anyway. And a crowd of people grabbed him and they beat him and they were going to kill him. They were trying to kill him when the Romans stepped in and stopped him from being killed. And then, inexplicably, they allowed Paul to address the crowd and to speak to them. And again, he tries to show them and prove to them, I'm one of you. He speaks to them in their own language. He calls them brothers. He calls them fathers. He talks about the God of our fathers, and he talks about being one of them, trying to relate to them, trying to build a bridge with them, and they wanted to kill him anyway. And then Paul was put on trial in front of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, and so he's put on trial in front of them, and again, he's making his case to them, and he mentions that he's on trial because of the resurrection of the dead, which actually caused the two sides of the council to fight with each other because the Pharisees believed in the coming resurrection and the Sadducees didn't, and so they start going at each other, and Paul is kind of pulled out of the mix of them. And then Paul finds out that there's a group of people who are so committed to executing him that they come up with a conspiracy, and there are 40 men who take a vow that say, I'm not going to eat food until we have killed Paul. And so they come up with this conspiracy, and they're dead set on killing Paul. Paul's friends and family hear about it. Paul's nephew comes and gives him that message. And so the Romans take him in protective custody to Caesarea, to the Roman capital of the province. And so Paul is moved to Caesarea, where he gets to stand on trial and make his case, defend his cause before the governor Felix. And that's where we pick up our story in Acts chapter 24 and verse 1. And if you're a fan of courtroom dramas, maybe that's what you should picture as we read this text, because that's exactly what's going on, is this is a courtroom drama. Acts chapter 24 and verse 1. And after 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders and a spokesman, one Tertullus. They laid before the governor their case against Paul. And when he had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, now Tertullus is their lawyer. He's the prosecuting attorney. And I want you to listen to the way that Tertullus speaks and the way that he talks to the governor. It says in the end of verse 2, since through you, again, this is Tertullus speaking to the governor, through you we enjoy much peace. And since by your foresight, most excellent Felix, reforms are being made for this nation, in every way and everywhere we accept this with all gratitude. But to detain you no further, I beg you in your kindness to hear us briefly. Can you hear the way he's saying these things? It goes far beyond respect, and it's flattery, isn't it? And he's trying to flatter the governor. He's trying to manipulate the governor so that he will see things their way and so that he will put Paul to death or he will punish Paul. He says in verse 5 about Paul, for we have found this man a plague, one who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world and is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, but we seized him. Now, we've been following the story all along, so we know these are false accusations, aren't they? There's nothing to this. Paul has been preaching and teaching throughout the world, but he's never stirred up riots. Paul's never once stirred up a riot, tried to get people angry and incited them to anger and to rioting. That's never been what Paul has done. And profane the temple, Paul had purified himself. He was going through all of the rituals and the customs to purify himself when he was in the temple. He didn't even bring in his Gentile brothers and sisters into the holiest part of the temple. He wasn't profaning the temple. None of these accusations are true. But this actually illustrates exactly what Jesus always said would be the case for his people. Do you remember in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5? Jesus says, blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Blessed are you. Blessed are you. Fortunate are you. Count yourself blessed. Count yourself fortunate. Count yourself happy. He goes on to say, rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. He says, when people accuse you falsely on my account, when people utter all kinds of evil against you, when they revile you and they insult you and they accuse you, you are blessed. And so this is what Paul is experiencing. Verse 8, by examining him, Tertullus goes on, by examining him yourself, you will be able to find out from him about everything of which we accuse him. The Jews also joined in the charge, affirming that all these things were so. And when the governor had nodded to him to speak, Paul replied, knowing that for many years you have been a judge over this nation, I cheerfully make my defense. Now notice the difference between the way that Paul talks to Felix and the way Tertullus spoke to Felix. Because with Paul, there's respect and there's kindness, but there's no flattery. He's not trying to flatter. He's not trying to manipulate. He's not trying to trick him into seeing things his way or doing things his way. Why? Because that's not how Paul operated. That's not how Christians are supposed to operate. Christians aren't supposed to flatter. Christians aren't supposed to manipulate or trick people into seeing things our way or doing things our way. Paul is concerned with the facts, with what is true. He says in verse 11, you can verify that it is not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem. And they did not find me disputing with anyone or stirring up a crowd, either in the temple or in the synagogues or in the city. Neither can they prove to you what they now bring up against me. His entire defense rests on this. These accusations that they're bringing against me are not true. And Paul invites scrutiny. He invites examination. Check it out. Examine me. Show me. Look into my case. You can verify the things that I'm saying to you. There is no proof because I wasn't stirring up crowds. I wasn't inciting riots. I wasn't trying to tear anything down. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone or make anyone angry. If Paul had tried to stir people up and make people angry and incited people and stirred up a riot, then their accusations against him would be true. But his whole defense is, this isn't true. This isn't the way I live my life. This isn't the way Christians live their lives. This isn't the way Christians handle things. When Paul wrote to the church at Thessalonica, he said this, aspire to live quietly and to mind your own affairs and to work with your hands as we instructed you, so that you may walk properly. Listen, so that you may walk properly before outsiders. Paul knew, and he taught the Christians, he taught the churches, that the people in the world are always watching you. The unbelievers are watching you, and it's up to you. It's important. It's paramount that you protect your credibility, that you live your lives this way, that you aspire to live quiet lives, that you mind your own affairs, that you work hard with your hands, that you walk properly before outsiders because they are always watching you. And your credibility is always on trial. If Paul had done what they accused him of doing, if he was seditious, if he was causing people, inciting people to riot and making them angry and stirring them up, then there would have been truth to the accusations that they leveled against him. But as it stands, they were false accusations. And Paul is saying, I try to live my life this way, quietly, minding my own affairs and encouraging others to do the same. He says in verse 14, but this I confess to you, that according to the way, which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men themselves accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. He says, actually, we have way more in common than we do not in common. We worship the same God. These men that are accusing me, we worship the same God. We read the same Bible. Everything that I'm saying came from the law and the prophets. We worship the same God. We read the same Bible, and we have the same hope. This hope that I have of the resurrection of the dead, these men share that hope. They share that belief. It's simply that Paul believed that Jesus was the one through whom these things were being fulfilled. He's saying we actually have way more in common than we do that's dissimilar. We worship the same God. We have the same Bible. We have the same hope. He says in verse 16, so I always take pains to have a clear conscience toward both God and man. I don't want to get crossway with God, obviously. I don't want to disobey God. I don't want to do anything against God's will. But I also have no interest in getting crossway with people either. I want to have a clear conscience before God, but I also want to have a clear conscience before people. And I'm trying everything I know how to do what is right, to do things that are above board, to do things that are good and pure, and to keep a clean conscience before God and people. He says in verse 17, now after several years I came to Jerusalem to bring alms, that is charity, to my nation. and to present offerings. While I was doing this, they found me purified in the temple without any crowd or tumult. But some Jews from Asia, and they ought to be here before you and to make an accusation should they have anything against me. He was zealous for what was good. He was doing what was right. Not only what was right in God's sight, but what was right in the sight of people. Doing what was right, not stirring up a crowd, not making people angry, not disobeying things, not hating people, not tearing things down, but doing what was good and doing what was right. And they hated him anyway, but he says, where are they? The people from Asia that made these accusations in the first place, that he was defiling the temple, they weren't even there in the courtroom. If they have something against me, if they're going to make an accusation, if this is going to stand, where are they? Let them come. Prove it. Prove to you that I did the things that they accused me of doing. He says in verse 20, or else let these men, those that are there, let these men themselves say what wrongdoing they found when I stood before the council, the Sanhedrin. Or other than this one thing that I cried out while standing among them, it is with respect to the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you this day. Paul said, I even went on trial in front of the Sanhedrin. I stood in front of these men. They had their opportunity to prove that I had committed some crime, done something wrong, hurt someone, stirred up people, incited a riot, did something wrong. I opened myself up to examination, interrogation, and they tried me. And still, they couldn't prove anything against me because I didn't do what they accused me of doing. In fact, Felix has no evidence on which to convict Paul, but he holds him in prison anyway. For the next 2 years, Paul stays in prison in Caesarea. And Felix has no evidence on which to convict him, but he holds him in prison anyway. It reminds me, again, of what Paul writes to Titus later on, Titus chapter 2, verses 7 and 8. Listen, he says, show yourself in all respects to be a model of good works. And in your teaching, show integrity, dignity, and sound speech that cannot be condemned, so that an opponent may be put to shame, having nothing evil to say about us. Peter said the same thing. Paul says the same thing. Jesus says the same thing. Live your life this way so that an opponent has nothing they can say against you, so that they are ashamed, so that they are eventually shamed for the accusations that they bring against you. Now, you can't control whether or not anybody accuses you. You can't control whether or not people like you. You can't control what people think about you. You can't control how people feel about you. You can't control what people say about you or what people do to you. But what you can control is your attitude and your actions. Your attitude and your actions determine the accuracy of their accusations. I know that sounds like Dr. Seuss. Let me say it one more time. Your attitude and actions determine the accuracy of their accusations. You can't control whether or not they accuse you, but you can control whether or not their accusations are true, whether or not they are accurate. You're in control of that. You can't determine whether or not people like you, how people feel about you, what people think about you, what people say about you, but you can determine what you will say, what you will do, how you will live your life. And this is what Paul is saying. This is what Peter is saying. This is what Jesus is saying. Live your life in such a way that when people accuse you, eventually they are ashamed because their accusations are not true. That doesn't mean you're going to be perfect. That doesn't mean that I'm going to be perfect. That means that we're going to try to live our lives, strive to live our lives so that when they accuse us of being hateful, when they accuse us of being bigoted, when they accuse us of whatever it is that they want to accuse Christians of, then it turns out their accusations are not true. Now, it could be that their accusations are true. And if someone accuses us of something, then we should examine ourselves and ask ourselves, is this true? Is it true what non-Christians are saying about me? Is it true what non-Christians are saying about us collectively? And if it's true, then we need to change. We need to repent. But sometimes, even when you're loving people, even when you're following Jesus, even when you're loving your neighbors and you're loving your family and you're loving the church and you're even loving your enemies, sometimes they're going to hate you anyway. Sometimes they're going to accuse you anyway. And instead of stomping our feet or waving our fist, instead of getting angry or afraid, remember the words of Jesus. And he says, blessed are you. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. For your reward is great in heaven, for so they treated the prophets who were before you. Consider yourself blessed. Live your life so that if they accuse you, if they hate you, if they utter evil things against you, their accusations are proven false, and you consider yourself blessed. This is the life that we are adopting. This is the life that we're stepping into when we're baptized into Jesus, isn't it? And maybe there's somebody here this morning and you're ready to step into that life of being forgiven and that life of following him and leaving all of the consequences up to him, doing what is pleasing to him. And sometimes your neighbors and your family and your community will respond well to that. Sometimes they'll love you because you love them. And sometimes they won't. And following Jesus means we do it anyway. We do what is right anyway. We live our lives with a good conscience before God and before people, not because they always respond well to it, but because that is the way of Jesus. And maybe you're ready to step into that by being baptized into Christ. Or maybe you need to come back to that. Maybe you've wandered away, and maybe their accusations against you are true, and you need to make some changes in your life. Or maybe you just need prayers or encouragement. Our shepherds would love to pray with you after service, or you can come forward right now. As together we stand and sing this song.